Excellent. Okay, item 8, the coastal hazards community engagement. Why? Welcome. I'll get you to give an overview of what the decision we're making today is, and then we can go into questions.
Sure. Yep, we're on. So my name's Jane Morgan and this is Mikey Anderson. Also presenting today will be Katie McRae and Mark Rushworth. Today we'll be briefing you on our proposed community engagement on coastal hazards and seeking agreement from you to release the documentation that sits behind that. So we are proposing to run a comprehensive community engagement on coastal hazards across the 2 programs of work that underpin this. So what we're proposing to release is an updated coastal hazards assessment, and that is a document that's been prepared to provide communities with a better understanding of what sea level rise will do in terms of impacts of flooding, erosion and groundwater across the whole district. We'll be releasing that document for information and using it to work with communities to better understand those impacts. We're also seeking your approval to release 2 documents for consultation. One is the Coastal Adaptation Framework, and that underpins the adaptation planning program, in which we'll work with communities to establish adaptation plans for the future. The other document is a coastal hazards plan change issues and options paper, and we're also wanting to consult on that. Mark will be briefing you on that piece of work. We're proposing to run the engagement from tomorrow, essentially, through to the 15th of November. Coastal hazards are a big issue relating to sea level rise, not just in Christchurch but across the world. However, in Christchurch we are quite exposed. We have a long, low-lying coastline and we have a lot of our assets and infrastructure located along our coastline. There are 2 figures up there I'd draw your attention to. One is that there's around about $1 billion of local government owned infrastructure exposed across Canterbury. The majority of that will be in our district, and around about $6.7 billion worth of buildings exposed along the coastline in the city. We've also started to see some research around the potential for insurance retreat to start occurring in the next 30 years, which is relatively soon. So these issues really are all driving us towards the need to start planning and working with communities in Runanga around how we're going to approach these challenges in the future. A reminder that you have established in August last year a coastal hazards working group, and many of you here sit on that. Also alongside councillors, we have 2 Papatipu Runanga representatives on that working group and 2 ECAN representatives on the working group. We also have Selwyn and Waimakariri sitting in, so we have that kind of joined up approach across the districts. And the working group's responsibility has been to oversee these 2 programs of work, the adaptation planning work and the plan change. We've had a lot of value and input from the working group, and they've overseen the documents that we're going to be sharing with you today. So we know these issues are really challenging for communities, particularly the people who are affected, or the homeowners in those communities and people who've lived in those communities, but sometimes for generations. It's a very sensitive conversation to have, and it has been one that hasn't always gone smoothly in the past. So we've done a lot of work around looking at lessons learned from past experiences. We've done a lot of listening to coastal communities over the last year or so as well. We've been out and about in places like South Shore and other parts of the city, and we've really heard what communities are concerned about. We've also got some psychosocial advice around how we hold these conversations with communities in a way that is really respectful and empathetic and will understand their perspectives. So with all of this in mind, we are intending to try and do things a little differently this time. So you'll hear today that we are really releasing these documents very early in the process, and we're seeking community engagement right from the outset. We want to know how communities want these things done. Coastal hazards information is pretty technical and quite challenging to understand. It's very complicated at times. So we've put a huge emphasis on plain language, accessible information, and we have a wide range of resources, from videos that will come out next week to fact sheets, to lengthy technical reports, to short pieces of web information and an online portal. So we're really looking to cater for all different audiences. We're also seeking to have face-to-face conversations, so we really are hoping to be able to engage with a lot of different community groups right across the district over the next 5 weeks. It's really important that we hear different views. we will really want to hear, of course, from our coastal residents. We're also looking to understand what people across the wider city see as the values of the coastline, because we all use our coastlines. And when I say coastlines, I do mean beaches, rivers, estuary environments as well. And we want to understand how people perceive the cultural and ecological values in those areas as much as the social and community values. We want to understand how people value our infrastructure. It's really important to us that we talk to children and young people, because this is really about future impacts and the future of our city, and their voice will be integral to this conversation. Engagement with Ngāi Tahu is core to this piece of work. We have Ngāi Tahu Runanga sitting, Papatipu Runanga representation on our working group, and we'll be working with Runanga as we go into planning with communities. Just a refresher on the adaptation planning program. As you know, we are working on the flooding, erosion and groundwater aspects and right across the district. So our purpose is to work with communities over time to develop those adaptation plans. We know that we have a number of communities to work with, and so in November last year, you agreed that the program would be established and that we would start working in the Whakaropō Littleton adaptation area first up. That process is intended to begin next year, and once that's concluded, we will then move around the district and work with other communities over time. I'll hand over to Mikey.
No worries. So our coastal hazard assessment has been updated for the purpose of this work, as Jane's mentioned, and that really is the evidence base for both of those projects that we're looking at engaging on. We have been able to incorporate up-to-date new information, particularly around extreme water levels, sediment supply from the Waimakariri down the open coast, and rising groundwater as well as some of the key data changes there. What this assessment tells us is how those existing hazards, so the flooding, erosion and rising groundwater, are likely to change over time with sea level rise. We've focused instead of focusing on some fixed timeframes and fixed climate change projections in the future, we've really tried to shift the focus of this coastal hazard assessment to a range of sea level rise increments from 0 in the current day status to 1.5 metres or 2 metres, which could relate to beyond 100 years in the future. And the reason that we've done this is it just allows us, one, to see the incremental change over time, but also so that we're not picking a winner. And if that data, particularly the climate change projections, and we have had a recent update, change, our data still broadly aligns with that. It also allows us to see those points in time when we get some significant changes in our district as well. So for erosion, for example, with 40 to 60 centimetres of sea level rise, we see quite a change in our processes, and it just really helps us to understand those hazards. We've covered a wider geographic area, so previously it was just a few bays in Littleton Harbour and Akaroa Harbour, and we've now measured flooding and erosion and groundwater for the whole of Banks Peninsula as well as the Christchurch city area. We incorporated a technical review process, and that was a rolling technical review throughout as we developed our methodology and undertook the assessment. So that's provided us with a really robust basis for our science, and we also had coastal scientists from ECAN involved in that project team as well, and just keeping oversight the whole way through the process. We know that this is a topic that's of particular concern to communities, and we wanted to provide some opportunities in developing the assessment for people to understand what the information was that we were gathering, and also help us shape up those communications that Jane's talked about. So we had a group of community stakeholders that were interested in coastal and environmental sort of technical work, and we got them involved, and they really helped us shape up those communications. So what we are going out with, the really key piece of information is that online portal. This is an interactive coastal hazard map where you can change the time frame, the amount of sea level rise, zoom in and out around the district to see how those impacts might change over time. There's a lot of information on there. You can just get a quick view, you can drill down and understand a lot more information, and we see that as the first place that everyone should be going for this information. We've got a really long technical report which tells us everything we might need to know about our process that we took, but we've actually been able to distill that into a short summary report as well, which is about 25 pages and includes some really snappy area summaries. There's 6 for the whole district, and they're just an A3 one page. They give an overview of the coastal environment, outline the different methodology that's taken in that area, and then a bit of the key findings. So generally what might happen in the shorter term and longer term in these areas. If nothing else, that is the one thing that would be great for communities to be able to have a look at. We've also got some short videos coming out next week, where we've tried to concretise some of the impacts of what these coastal hazards might mean in different areas, and we've got coastal scientists talking to those videos. So they'll be, again, something that we'll be rolling out in our engagement with communities, and we encourage you all to have a look. That's probably it from me. I'll pass over.
So alongside the Coastal Hazards Assessment, we are seeking approval for you today to release the Coastal Adaptation Framework. Essentially, this is setting out Council's proposed approach to undertaking adaptation planning with communities. The reason we've done this is that we want to be really upfront about our proposed approach, and we want to seek engagement from the community around that, seek feedback to make sure we've heard those voices. Our intention is that we want to have a relatively equitable process as we roll this out across the district, and the parameters sort of set within the adaptation framework will provide that continuity. We've also seen examples around the country where they haven't kind of front-footed exactly what council will be prepared to accept or not, and after lengthy community engagement, sometimes adaptation plans have stalled. So we wanted to get ahead of that potential for that to happen. So the Adaptation Framework sets out council and community roles and responsibilities, guiding principles, and a proposed engagement and decision-making process. And this is really what we're hoping communities will engage with and provide us with feedback on over the next few weeks. We are setting out our legal roles. Essentially, council's role primarily is to manage risks to our own assets, our public infrastructure, which of course we are the shepherds of for the communities. And we are being upfront that council does not have any explicit legal obligation to protect privately owned properties from coastal hazards. The private asset owner's role is similar. It is primarily to manage risks to their assets as well. So we're just putting that up front to make sure that we're being really clear. The guiding principles, they are longer in the framework, but I'll summarise them for you today. And these are them here. We see it as really important to go through this process in a partnership approach with Ngāi Tahu Runanga. Obviously, there are a lot of cultural values around the coastlines, and therefore it's really important that we take a partnership approach there. We know that every community is different. We're not looking at a one-size-fits-all approach to adaptation planning by any means. In every community, there'll be different scale issues, there'll be different coastal environments, and there'll be different values. And we want to reflect those in the way that we develop our plans. The plans are likely to be different. We're hoping the process remains relatively similar. We are going to be undertaking adaptation planning with communities as a whole, but our focus and any public funds will be directed to public assets that underpin those communities. So we're talking about the roads, the waters, the parks, the things that build communities and that communities are built on. So it's going to be a comprehensive look at communities with a focus on those assets for public funding. We are probably working in an environment of the most uncertainty of many projects, although uncertainty is kind of the flavour of our lives these days. But we don't know exactly when these impacts will occur or where, or exactly the timing of those impacts, I should say. We don't know what the statutory environment will look like in the future, and we don't know what technologies may be developed to address these issues. So the best we can really do is look at a range of options with an open mind and a range of scenarios and try and be as adaptable as possible as we're planning our process. The IPCC report said that the impacts of sea level rise are likely to occur for centuries and millennia. So it's really important that we are recognising the intergenerational equity issues here. We can't afford to kick the can down the road and make this a problem for our children and our grandchildren and their children. We need to take a more responsible approach, we think. And so what we'll be looking for there are adaptation options and pathways that are not forcing the burden onto future generations. And there may be some tough decisions that we have to make in that respect. The last two bullet points up there really come from the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement that guides a lot of this work. And we are required to prioritise natural and nature-based options over hard protection options. We won't always be able to find nature-based options that work. Sometimes we'll have to go for hard protection, but we have to remember that the environment has to adapt as well. And sometimes there are options that are more amenable to helping that and others that are less so. The Coastal Policy Statement also requires us to keep managed retreat on the table. That is not us saying there's a predetermined outcome of retreat. That is absolutely not what that is about. It's simply saying we can't knock that out and dismiss it as an option. It is something we're going to have conversations about because in reality there will be some areas in which we will have to retreat from in the future. We're also setting out our proposed engagement and decision-making process, and what we are suggesting here is that we will establish a coastal panel to work in each adaptation area, so it will be a different coastal panel as we move around the city. The coastal panel will have community representation and Runanga representation on it. We're also looking for, there will also be a zone committee rep and a community board rep from those areas, and we have the potential to add citywide representation as well. So what we're really looking for in those coastal panels is diversity. We want to have diverse voices, diverse ages and demographics. So there is a requirement for us to have 2 young people on each coastal panel. We may have more, but that's the minimum. And where we may not have, for example, in a community, someone who steps up with perhaps commercial expertise, that's where a citywide representative could be appointed into the panel to allow for that, that mix of different voices. The coastal panel's role is to undertake an analysis of all of the adaptation options and identify preferred adaptation pathways for a council decision. They'll be supported in that by a specialist and technical advisory group, or the STAG. On the STAG, we have a range of experts. So we'll have, we've got a planner, we'll have economist, public health expert, of course we'll have coastal science and coastal engineering, and a range of other voices. We have cultural expertise from MKT. So their role isn't to vote on anything, but it is to help provide the coastal panel with expertise and information to support their decision making. Sitting on top of this process will be an independent chair. We are cognizant of the wider community's interest in this process, so at particular points as we run through this process, we'll go back out and touch base with the wider community and just check in with them and get feedback on where the coastal panel is going with this process. So that's what's in the Coastal Adaptation Framework. Attached to the Coastal Adaptation Framework is this catalogue of coastal hazards adaptation options. And it's essentially a literature review of the wide range of adaptation options that are available across these kinds of categories. So people often immediately jump to things they know that they've seen before, but there are many different ways of doing this. And we want to engage communities in this conversation around understanding some of the different things they might not have thought of, the opportunities that sit in some of these different adaptation options, and also some of the trade-offs. Some options will help us to help the environment adapt. Other options might mean that we continue to have access to natural beaches. Others may not. So it's just understanding what's sort of on the table and what isn't in terms of that. When you're looking across those options, just to be clear, an adaptation pathway is not just going to have one option. It probably will have a mix of options and a mix across all of those different categories. So I'd really encourage people to have a look at the catalogue. There are 2 versions. There's a long literature review version with a lot of sort of more academic research sitting behind it, and then there's a sort of a mini version which is a bit more quick read for people who might want to look at that. So I'll now hand over to Mark to talk about the plan change. Oh no, I won't. Too soon. Let's forget this slide. I wanted to emphasise that council working with communities is a really important part of this picture, but we are not the only players in this mix. Central government has indicated they will be putting forward a Climate Adaptation Act. It's intended to go to the House in 2023, and that's really to work through those complex issues around managed retreat, because this is an issue that affects across coastal communities right across the country. They're also going to be looking at how to fund and finance adaptation planning, so that's something we're keeping a very close eye on. We've also been working really closely with Insurance Council of New Zealand, because we know that homeowners are going to be really concerned about insurance. The Insurance Council of New Zealand, have talked to us at length about the role of insurers is to deal with risk. And so insurers are always looking at risk information right across the world. They're working with reinsurers on this. And so I guess the message there really is that, this is a global issue, and there will be global decisions made by insurers. However, what the Insurance Council has said is that insurers gain confidence by seeing that communities, councils and runanga, other stakeholders are working together to actively plan and manage these risks. And so the more confidence they can get that we are providing that guidance, that information is being generated around plans and around strategies, that gives insurers more confidence that they could remain in the market. There's a fact sheet that we produced with ICNZ, and that's on the website, and I'd encourage people to have a look at that. Of course, the regional government ECAN has a role as well, and they're signalling that they'll be notifying their RPS and their Regional Coastal Environment Plan in 2024. So there are other players in this mix. We're just trying to do the part that we can do, which is work with the local communities that we are connected to.
Yeah, Mark.
Okay. Thanks, Jane. Sorry, can I get this? Thank you. So at present, there's a gap in the current district plan provisions. It doesn't reflect the full extent of the identified coastal hazards, and it doesn't manage all activities that could be exposed to risk. As a consequence, there's a risk that development can occur without adequate controls being in place. Additionally, we need to make sure that the plan gives effect to higher order planning documents, in particular the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So the plan change is part of the wider programme, as Jane has said, and this is enabling a more holistic approach to coastal hazards. We're using the common data source, and I think the key distinguishing feature in terms of the plan change is it's focused on new development and seeks to manage risks ahead of the adaptation plans being implemented. So we want to get ahead of the game and not just be picking up the pieces later. So what are we doing different this time? We're aware of the previous attempts to incorporate the coastal hazard provisions into the district plan, and we're looking to do things differently this time. We're proposing to take a step back from where we were before and allow more time for engagement with the community and to have discussions about how we go forward. And the starting point we're suggesting is the issues and options paper that looks at a range of possible approaches that are available to us and seeks to get input to help confirm which direction we should take before we start to develop the more detailed provisions. We're also at this stage looking to consider how we can incorporate new and innovative approaches to managing coastal hazards and development. And Jane mentioned there's the catalogue of options, and some of the ideas in there may come into play in terms of informing how we can think about the district plan provisions. And we've also got a better understanding of the different levels of risk and how this could influence the plan as well. So the scope of the district plan change would be that it would be district-wide. It would consider all of the coastline and coastal hazard risks across the city and Banks Peninsula. The primary focus would be around flooding and erosion. We've given consideration to groundwater in there. And one of the other areas that we're wanting to have a conversation around is how best to approach tsunami risk, because these are significant but more infrequent events, and there are other roles such as civil defence that come into play with that. So that's part of the discussion here. And we're looking at utilising not just the baseline data from the coastal hazard assessment, but doing some further analysis to look at what that means in terms of risk to both people and property. So in terms of what's in the issues and options paper, we've identified a range of options and possible ideas as to how these can approach coastal hazard matters. We've not settled on a specific solution, and we're seeking feedback to help provide a steer as to which option should be developed further. However, we have identified a preferred option that we think is worthy of more careful consideration, and I'll come on to talk about that now. So the preferred option recognises that the level of risk isn't uniform across all the hazard areas, and that there's a range of management responses we could develop to manage those risks in response to the different local circumstances. Areas at risk from coastal hazard have been separated into a range of risk categories, and that's been based on international best practice. And this allows us to take a more balanced approach to facilitating land use and managing risk, so that we can enable communities to continue to meet their social and economic and cultural needs where it is safe to do so. So in terms of the flooding aspects and risks, we've considered the certainty of hazards occurring and the potential for change that could happen over time. We've looked in particular at the depth and speed of water inundation and the consequences that has for both people and properties. And as a result of that, we've identified 4 categories of risk, and this enables that finer grain approach, so we don't have to use a one-size-fits-all solution through the planning framework. Moving on to erosion, the impact of erosion is always going to be high, so likelihood was selected as a key determinant in identifying the risk categories. We've also looked at the 5 different types of coastal environment, so that's ranging from the dunes on the open coast around to the cliffs on the headlands. In most instances, there's not as much differentiation for erosion as there was for the flood risk. So there are only 2 categories of erosion risk that have been identified. So that's a medium-high risk and a low risk. And again, what this enables us to do, to combine with the different risk environments, is to come up with a more bespoke response to those particular hazards. And then finally, just wrapping up the why we're looking at doing things now and perhaps not delaying for things that are coming down the track. We're aware that there is significant reform of the Resource Management Act in process at the moment. We've taken advice from the Ministry for the Environment, in particular on the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. And the advice is that policy position isn't likely to change. It will be rolled forward and incorporated into the new National Planning Framework. And therefore, we've got some confidence that the policy environment is going to be reasonably stable through that period of change. The other matter here is that whilst the Natural and Built Environment Act may go through Parliament and be put on the legislature next year, there's going to be a gap between enactment and any new plans coming into place, and that's possibly several years that could go by. And for us, the major concern there is that there's a risk that development will continue to happen in areas that are exposed to risk. And we think it's therefore prudent to be approaching that topic now and consulting on the issues and options paper.
So just quickly, I'd like to go through the communications and engagement we've got planned for this. Just this slide up again, just to show you we've got the Coastal Hazards Assessment out there for information. That's available in the summary report and the full technical report and also the online viewer. And then for engagement, we have the Coastal Adaptation Framework and the Coastal Hazards Plan Change Issues and Options paper. So our challenge for this project is actually getting that diversity of voices involved in the conversation. We're very confident we're going to be able to hear from the coastal communities, but as my colleagues have already said, it's also really important that we hear from youth, from children, from people across the city. So our solution to this is to make it as relevant and as accessible as possible. We've used plain language in all of our documentation, and we've really tried hard with some quite technical stuff to make it as accessible as possible. We have that online portal, the intuitive maps, which are a huge step forward on anything we've had previously. And we've got that information for different levels of interest. So if people are minorly interested, they can pop onto the website and have a quick overview. If they have more of an interest, we have fact sheets available for them, which goes into a little bit more depth. And then they can lose themselves for several hours or days in the technical reports if they would like to as well.
We've got videos as well, and we're going to have information available electronically and in hard copy format. We're going to have drop-ins around Christchurch and Banks Peninsula, and we're also going to where the people are. We already have made it to the guest list of some residents associations and networks out there, and we will continue to sort of like plug what we have to offer in the hope that we'll get further invitations over the 5 weeks of engagement. We've got targeted youth and children's engagement as part of this process, and we're going to be using all of the channels available to us, newsline, newsletters, websites, social media, and we've also got some library displays as well.
That concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Questions, Jake?
Thank you. On the subject of the coastal panels, was there one or was there multiple of them? How many did you envision, and what kind of areas do they encompass?
So we're proposing to start in Whakaropo, Littleton Harbour next year, and we would have a coastal panel that would sit across that area. And so when we were to move to another community, we would establish another coastal panel.
And in terms of the workload for these panels, what kind of commitment are members on it making?
Well, we haven't done this before, but our best guess looking at other projects around or similar processes around the country is a year and a half, probably meeting once a month, that type of thing. There will be some engagements with the wider community. We may have wānanga with runanga as part of that as well. It's a bit hard to tell, but we will be providing an honorarium to the coastal panel members.
Cool, thank you.
And I should say also we're providing them with some training and support, because sometimes being a representative for a community can be quite challenging to do.
Did you give any consideration to just funneling this work through the community boards? And if that wasn't desirable, why not?
We did consider that. The model that's more typically used is a coastal panel model, which is almost like more like a citizens jury approach. And I guess that what you get from that is the diversity of voice that may represent just people who live in a community. They may not otherwise be actively engaged in these issues, and I suppose that's some of the benefit that we were looking at there.
Tim, thanks.
Thank you. I'll start with the easy one. With our modelling, our mapping, like we can go in with regards to pressing a button. So with regards to that, so for instance, we go in today, there's estimated global climate change, etc., sea level rise. So in 10 years, if I go into it, so is it going to be kept current to how the acceleration or deceleration of climate change is happening?
It's a really good question. So at the moment, our modelling...
I'll do the odd one, mate. I'll do the odd one.
At the moment...
Yeah, no. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to give you bad news, so I've got to sugarcoat it first. No. Ultimately, our current modelling is based on a baseline of 2020, which is when a lot of our data was sort of current for, and particularly our land level data, so it's based on 2020. And the way that it works is if you want to move the slider up a time frame, it'll give you a range of sea level rise scenarios, so those future climate projections that sea level rise would relate to for that time frame. So you can kind of look at the more pessimistic version, the more optimistic version, and sort of draw your own consensus really around which sea level rise you want to look at. Over time, if the sea level rise is accelerating or maybe those projections change, we can actually just update the little bit of the future climate projections to show that, and it will move, higher up the sea level rise band. So we've got quite a lot of flexibility in the way we've done this modelling.
Or lower, depending.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you. And my second question. The comment with regards to continual development in high-risk areas. So there was a comment made with regards to councils not responsible, but technically, if we're allowing to develop in high-risk areas and future high-risk areas, looking at the plan that you can go on, will there be a legal case at some stage, I presume, that if councils, irrelevant of where they are in New Zealand, are allowing development in high-risk areas, that we're aware of it, will there not be a comment at some stage that we are responsible? I'm just thinking,
I think might be better answered by council legal.
Okay, well, just if we could get just a comment on that. But going back to the first with regards to allowing development in high-risk areas and areas we know, because we've got infrastructure, we've got a whole lot of problems there if we're going to allow it. What's your comment with regards to that? Is there going to be an option for us to say no?
Yeah, I mean, I say at the moment there is a gap in the plan, so development can take advantage of the other provisions in the plan, and in some cases development will be permitted or controlled, so will be able to happen. In other cases, we may have some degree of control through the assessment criteria, but what the looking at the plan change will do will be allow us to fill that gap, so we can then look at what the appropriate levels of control are. And certainly as the level of risk increases, you would expect the level of control would step up, and it will be not necessarily a case of prohibiting development, but it will be a case of much more stringent assessment criteria, needing to demonstrate that if development were to occur, then it wouldn't pose any unacceptable risk to people or property.
Would one of those requirements be that the house would have to be easily moved?
That could be one of the options. We're looking at a range of different factors. So it may be things like raising floor levels as a simple thing, as happens in some of the flood areas at the moment. It could be about having more adaptable buildings or relocatable buildings, and there may be some looking at time-bound restrictions around that, so that when certain things happen, that's the trigger point at which you have to look at relocating away from the hazard.
So I guess one of the things which is a concern is you go and you see a house quite high up, but the infrastructure that supports it, so if the sea rises half a metre, our ability to storm water and sewage, etc., is almost impossible in a low coastal area. But the house will be fine because it's on a wee island.
And that's actually where the adaptation planning conversation comes in, because that is about a more coordinated approach, I suppose, between council and communities around how we plan forward.
Yep, cool. Thank you.
Anne.
Good evening. Kia ora. Nice to see you all. Thank you for that. That's a huge amount of information, and it's hugely complex. And so the challenge, as you've said, is to try and communicate this stuff in a way that people understand. And I'm interested in the comment that was made about the training that council will, or council staff will be having to manage the sensitivity about these issues and dealing with the community. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, we all recently, the project team all recently went through some training, and it was really around cognitive science, how people understand and interpret information, and particularly when they're under stress or when the information is about something that's really uncertain. There was a real emphasis on storytelling. It doesn't go naturally with some bureaucrats' minds to be storytellers. We're working on it. Yeah. But no, it was really helpful, and it also is similar training will be given to the coastal panel, but more with a focus around some of the learnings from the How team experience, which was that it is tough being a community representative, available to your neighbours at the same time as representing or participating in a process that will lead to some decisions being made. So Hummingly delivered that for us. That's Jolie Wells. She's a locally based cognitive scientist, and it was an excellent training session. Really recommend it. Yeah.
Right, that's really great to hear that that's happening. I'm particularly interested in how you're going to manage the conversations with young people and children, because of that line between giving information and not creating anxiety.
Yes.
And I think that's, I'd like to know a bit more about how that's going to be managed.
We've actually had Sian Carville from Future Curious working with schools in the areas that are likely to be impacted by sea level rise for the last year and a half, and she's been doing that with us, but also because she developed a climate change curriculum that was accepted by the Ministry of Education. We've worked with her to add in a couple of extra lessons around adaptation, and some of the team have helped to teach those. Alongside that is a resource, a wellbeing resource, which again recognises that climate anxiety is of concern. But really, I guess the key message is for young people, it's about feeling that they have a voice and can actually provide meaningful input into this discussion and shape it. And that's what we're trying to respect, I guess, with the focus on engaging with children and young people in this conversation.
This
That's fine.
Yeah, how will you choose the young people that are going to be on the panels?
So for the panels, that's an expression of interest process, but we do have some people who've in the area that we are aware of. So we'll be working with the governance teams and also with the community on suggestions for that. But it is an expression of interest process.
Yanni.
Thank you, and thank you for the work that you've done. I know, you know, for those of us on the working party, we know how much work has gone into this. I guess just one thing that is quite different now than even when we had the last working party is just the whole pandemic and the COVID thing. And I guess I'm just looking at the time frame, wondering, given what's happening, which things seem to be moving quite quickly in a very different direction, whether this is the best time to be doing this engagement. Just thinking of particularly a number of the communities that are in here are also the ones that there needs to be a huge focus on wellbeing at the moment.
I guess there's not ever really going to be a great time to have this, but we do have a reason now to get this work underway. So we have tried to, future-proof our engagement tactics as much as possible. We're very mindful of what the communities are going through at the moment. There will always be wellbeing considerations, and we're going to be living with COVID now for quite some time. So I think it's probably we've done the best that we can. We're mindful, obviously, there are some communities in particular where COVID is a bigger conversation, and that's where the focus of their attention is going to be. But delaying this further is not necessarily going to achieve much more.
Have we thought, because we've also got 2 public holidays in here as well, have we thought about extending the time frame out?
So we deliberately included the public holidays for the sense that sometimes that actually works in the favour of groups to be able to do stuff over there. We had an opportunity of closing it before show weekend. We kept it open till afterwards because it gives people time to be able to put forward their feedback. It is open for 5 weeks of engagement, but we've also been signalling quite clearly that this is coming for about a week prior. So we're probably looking at about a 6-week period of time. In order to get this going before Christmas and leave it an appropriate time, and we don't want to run it too further into December, we thought that closing it with about 5 weeks of engagement till the 16th of November is about as long as we want to take it.
I mean, I just have a sense that our whole world's going to change in the next 2 months. I mean, what's happening up in Auckland hasn't kind of hit here yet, but it's all the stuff now is coming.
We can play it by
Are we
ear
able to
a certain extent, but I think I'd quite like to see how it runs.
Yeah, are we able to kind of have a point where we evaluate how the engagement's going and then look at if we need to make
Absolutely
extensions because we haven't heard from some people in the community?
And we know that a lot of the sort of like the meetings that we're being hosted by others, if they don't happen in person, they go to Zoom. So we know that there'll be opportunities to go online, but absolutely we can look at a halfway point and see what happens, because who knows, in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I think just also, I mean, the other thing is that, and our community board has certainly fed this back repeatedly, is we're still really worried about people that don't have access to the digital technology. And so, you know, there are parts of the area that does relate to. And so especially with COVID and level restrictions, not having face-to-face contact is quite a huge barrier to people engaging.
So we've certainly taken on board your feedback there around hard copy, and we're looking at displays that we can do in those local community libraries. Okay. However, that obviously, if you can't go out, if you can't go to your library, then that is going to affect it, and we take that on board.
Just the other thing, the final question from me is in terms of like the maps, if you look at, 59, which is the Bromley to Oni Plateau. I just think being able to give people a bit of a, like some of the suburbs that are mentioned are sort of cut in half, like Walston. Is there kind of a clear reason why those areas have been dropped off? I mean, half of Bromley's also dropped off, and I just don't get a sense from the information really that people will understand why. So are you able just to kind of give us an understanding of what happens in that grey area and why that's not being looked at?
Yeah, sure. So we did focus our assessment on areas where the coastal influence is dominant, and by that we mean the areas where with sea level rise, the impacts are going to be a lot more prominent than, for example, the river and rainfall impacts, which is further upstream. We know the areas further upstream will also be impacted over time with these processes, but currently it is more dominant rainfall and river impacts. The rainfall and river impacts already being managed currently through district plan, and there's also a lot of stormwater management that goes on in those areas and has gone on recently, and future plans that are in the works as well. So we know that the area that we need to focus on at the moment are those areas where the coastal influences are more dominant. Now, I know this is a kind of tricky thing to talk about where that line is. We have there is a technical basis for that. We took the river and rainfall modelling and we put it over our coastal modelling, and we looked at where it lined up really well and where it was more varied further upstream, and that's the basis for our line. We've also got some additions and some descriptions which we will add to our website over the next day or two that unpack that a little bit more and explain the basis for it.
Having said that, even though that might be the line for the technical information, it's not the line for the engagement. So we will be engaging with those communities, with drop-ins in the areas, and also with stuff in libraries.
The key message, even if you're in the grey, you can still engage with us.
Absolutely. City-wide engagement.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joni. Jake.
Something Anne said prompted another question from me on the panel. Who signs off on the panel?
Well, Coastal Hazards Working Group will make assessments around the expressions of interest.
So they sign it off? Yeah, cool.
Anne.
Just looking at the slide, the roles and responsibilities, it's got a very much a physical kind of lens on that. Is there a space where we think about our role in terms of community wellbeing in that space, and are we clear that we've got that articulated in some way through this?
Yeah, I guess we've looked at this process right from that lens because it is about communities and people. It's not really about the built objects in the environment, and so we are gaining advice as we go through this process, as I've kind of described to you a little bit. But there is a bit more to it too around how we work with communities in a way that is going to be respectful and empathetic and allow for communities to, I guess, plan forward themselves. The inclusion of, we have an expert on this, specialist and technical advisory group who comes from that perspective, and we're doing a little bit of research into how we support communities through these decision-making processes. So we've got a few things lining up which will help us when we start engaging with communities in that really detailed adaptation planning space. Yeah.
I guess I'm asking, would it be appropriate to have something written in that particular part that talks about that, as rather than so sort of explicitly say that? I don't know whether that's
possibly with when read as a whole.
Yes.
Our paper on, I'm trying to think what it's called at the moment.
Coastal Adaptation Framework.
That one. I deal with the other stuff. I don't even deal with that one. But our coastal adaptation paper is couched around this is with communities, for communities, all that sort of thing. That's just one point we wanted to raise to people's attention in this forum, just to be really upfront.
Yeah, and it may be some feedback we get as well that we need to flesh that out a little bit more as we go through the consultation phase.
Yeah. Thank you, that would be good.
Excellent. Well, I'm happy to move this. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Templeton. Any debate? Okay, Pauline.
But just to recognise the incredible work in this, and as part of the working group, we've got a big appreciation of that. But also, the I don't know. I just want to call out the way that you've presented this in a really clear, digestible manner, and you've condensed incredible technical information into this format. And I think that can't have been an easy task at all. And at the same time, you're including ability for people to go deeper if they want to. So I think you've really struck the sweet spot quite well, and just really want to call that out. It's an incredible achievement. Thank you.
Sarah.
Kia ora, I'd like to support that. The working group work and those workshops have been really well run and really useful for informing us and helping with that conversation. And I'm looking forward to the next stage of this going forward. I think it's really important that the community have a say in that overall framework for how we address adaptation over time. And I think that the district planning process, doing issues and options, so different to last time, I think will get people on side where they weren't last time as well. I know that there's still some distrust in the community, but I think that they can see that this looks so much better, and I think that you've done an enormous amount of work, all of you, in building up that trust, and that's crucial for the work that we've got ahead. One of the things that's really important is that adaptation is going to be needed, but we're not quite sure how much and when. And one of the key things that plays a role in how much and when is how much, as a city and as a world, we're able to mitigate climate change by lowering our emissions. If we continue to emit at the rate we are, emissions will keep increasing and the seas will rise higher than they might otherwise. So this is linked completely to the mitigation work that we have to do, and we all have to do that for the various coastal hazards, both sea level rise, coastal hazards, and drought and other things as well. Thank you.
Anne.
I just wanted to congratulate the work that you've done, particularly in things like going to where the people are and targeted engagement and identifying key people in the community. I mean, those are really important things that you're doing, using plain language. You know, that's hugely, it's a real change, you know, I see in the way that we're trying to work with communities, and I just want to thank you for that, because that's a key to this, is actually getting people to trust and to move, for all of us to be moving together. So thanks for that.
All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. We'll close the meeting with a karakia from Councillor Templeton.
Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai. Haumie, huie, tai kie.
Kia ora. Thank you, everyone. Catherine, I assume you said yes to last.
Yes, I did. Thank you.